I and several of the poets here tonight were founding members of a group that we call the Liberation Poetry Collective. It began in 2001, and we've published a couple of anthologies. In fact, the poems read tonight, as well as the ones read about a year ago, are going to be collected in a new anthology. Our tentative publication date is December.
It was not easy, but it was gratifying. We need the voice of the poet, the uncorrupted, the voice that is not compromised. The poet voice, the objective look at life, and also part of life. So it was not that difficult to put it together, but and I'm glad he has a great resonance. People come to support it.
I love taking part in forums like this one, particularly the Liberation poets, because these guys are all like the best of the best. They're senior poets, and they're committed. They're committed to social justice. They're committed to making change, and they're also committed to supporting the next generation of change artists and activists. And I'm just honored to be amongst them, and I aspire to be just like them. So.
It was very pleasant. It was another opportunity to build community, to make a contribution toward a unity that's necessary to deal with the subject of my piece, which was that Black Lives Matter.
I had a wonderful time, and I actually was very gratified to see that we had a good-sized audience. Doesn't always happen for poetry events. I know that my husband and I were talking about he went to some poetry readings, and some of the audience members, although they were poetry lovers, were saying, how can you just write poetry at a time like this, at times like these, with all these terrible things happening? Particularly referring, of course, to the as we were saying, of the killing of innocent, of unarmed black men in the streets, and the burgeoning sense of protest, which I hope keeps on going, that began this fall.
It was very inspiring, and but I think that we're part of a rising tide of consciousness among oppressed black people and people of color, and socially conscious white Americans as well.
Tonight's event actually, I think, was very good. Our collective has been together since 2000, and this was one of our really wonderful events. There was something about the tone and the way we were here for a purpose, not just to show our wares, our art, but of course that was important too.
It's becoming kind of a annual event. It's always an honor to read with people like Askia and Everett and Brenda, Walcott, who have paid their dues over and over and over again, and to not only participate with them but listen to their work, and to they energize me with their energy. So I'm always honored to participate in a program when they're there.
It's an honor to be among fellow artists who marry their creativity with political commitments and interests, and there's, I think, relatively little of that in the country as a whole, so it's nice to be in an environment where that is accepted and encouraged and welcomed, and not considered to be odd or strident or somehow marginal.
When we were trying to think of a title for this reading, getting together some of the original founders, some other people who've worked with us over time, we came up with all kinds of ideas, very long-winded, and I said, no, wait, poetry matters. That's what it is. Poetry matters.
Poetry is the last anchor, the last breath left when everything else is taken away from us. Poetry does matter because as you know, historically, poets have been killed because of what they believe, because of what they stand for. So poetry, and we're not talking about the poetry as decoration. We're talking about the poetry as mean for change. Poetry as part of the human condition. Poetry as accompanied human odyssey, human struggle. So poetry does matter.
Poetry is life, poetry matters, period. It's an opportunity to express one's feelings, but it's also an opportunity to comment on the world. And that's really important. And then for me, it's a part of the legacy. It's the legacy of these poets that I talked about. It's the legacy of those who came before us, like the Pablo Nerudas who were mentioned, or in my poem, Jose Marti. Jose Marti is like the father of Cuban poetry, and literally the nation runs through his blood, okay? If you ask children in Cuba about Marti, they could not only tell you about who he is, he's the father of the nation, but they could recite his poetry. And that to me is awesome, that a nation sees itself as descended from a poet, okay? But then again, it's also a legacy for me in terms of my own family. Like my father, who was an engineer, was like a closet poet. So he wrote poetry in the basement, just on his own. And, when he became a little bit older in life and he had more leisure time, he started to go out and connect with other community poets and joined a collective that used to meet right over at the Cambridge Public Library here in Central Square, an African-American collective of poets. He often wrote about, family issues. It was really that kind of poetry. And I read a poem about my uncle. And when those types of words and ideas come to me, I feel myself channeling my dad.
Poetry has mattered to me since Langston Hughes sat down with me at his alma mater, my alma mater, when I was a graduating senior, went over 2 of my poetry manuscripts and wrote some suggestions on one of them about improving it, making it more concrete and more rhythmical. And I took those suggestions to heart, and I submitted the poem to the annual competition for a Creative Writing Award. It won. Pivotal experience in my life. I'm saying, my goodness, if this is the busiest, most prolific, most popular black poet who's ever lived, author of 44 books, 10 books of poetry alone. This guy doing librettos and gospel plays and biographies and children's books and reviews, etc. If he saw something redeemable in that corny piece of rank and rhyme poetry, then maybe I'm more than just a guy who can write love poems and sell them to guys for $1 a piece so they can push them off to their girlfriends as original work, you understand, or incorporate them in their lovers. Maybe, in fact, I am a poet, So it's been important to me. It has mattered to me since then. But to the degree that the spirit among conscious poets in all parts of the world who are about human rights and about justice is the action, the passion, the musicality, the affirmations are a kind of universal language, And so that goes from the Spanish, the Portuguese, the Yoruba, the English, the French, the whatever, Arabic, that you have these kinds of poets all over the world. Poetry matters to me because it nourishes me, it helps me live and express myself more fully.
Poetry matters because as Tontongi said in a part of his introduction, it is times like these when the voice of the poet can be a voice to follow. Somebody quoted Howard Zinn, I think, earlier, saying that one poem can start a movement, a pamphlet can spark a revolution. Certainly true historically and today.
Well, I think the poets and the artists are the keepers of dreams and visions for any population. The people who encourage their fellow citizens to think in terms of potential and victories and our better angels. Unfortunately, we seem to be in the hands of people who are repressive towards citizens and who seem to focus on the worst to divide people and create systems of oppression. And of course, the poet, all artists have to be on the front lines upholding the sacredness of the human spirit and inspiring people to dream and envision a better life for themselves and their fellow citizens and fellow human beings.
Poetry gave me and gives me the means to go on, the means to believe, and to transcend at times.
Well, I've been writing poetry for a long time. I think I wrote my first poem when Dr. King was assassinated. And so I was instrumental in putting together groups in Boston. We did readings at Wally's Cafe in the mid-'90s. In the latter part of the 90s, we created the Guna Ike Galleria, which we sort of created the Renaissance in poetry readings in Boston. So, this is in some ways kind of a reunion of sorts of some of the deeper, more meaningful, thoughtful, revolutionary poets in the country.
Well, I think the society that we live in spends a lot of energy manipulating and abusing language. Uses language as an instrument of power to manipulate and to brainwash people, to implant needs and desires that are false, through advertising and political propaganda, really. So poetry takes language seriously and tries to preserve its integrity.
This is our second anthology of liberation poetry, published by Trilingual Press, which includes the work of the poets who read here tonight and several others as well who have worked with us and who share the idea of poetry as part of the act of liberation, of poetry in not in service, but of poetry that is imbued with a sense of wanting to make the world better and a better place for all people and for social justice. So this has, I'm one of the co-editors of it, Tontongi and myself, has an introduction, and it has many poets, as I said, who aren't here tonight, men, women, young and old. It's a wonderful, diverse group. Most of them are connected to Boston, and some are from other places. So if you're interested in getting your copy, you can, if you want, you can go online to trilingualpress.com or on Facebook and order a copy. It's also available at Amazon.